And then by day, I am in the marketing technology space. So for me, it's all about bringing customer experiences together. So data, technology, marketing, all comes together. That's my main field. I've been doing that for about 20 years. And then, of course, father, husband. I have 3 kids, and recently just graduated from what's called the Colson Fellows Program for Biblical Worldview. It's a 10-month intensive that teaches what is biblical worldview and all the competing worldviews. It helps drive why do you believe what you believe. Versus, hey, I believe I do this, and so therefore now I want to believe what I do and justify that, which is kind of the basis for a lot of the things that go on behind this topic, because we make a lot of assumptions about this. So really, what we'll cover today, the talk track's really in 3 parts. It's really not a difficult conversation to have. It's not a difficult topic. Sometimes we make it difficult because it talks about death and it talks about dying. And so what do we do with that? One of our challenges, we have a cognitive environment in which we today live in, and we apply a lot of that to something that happened well over 3,000 years ago. I'm going to hit on some of the typical approaches and typical ways people talk about this. But really what we're going to spend our time in, we're going to cover the term genocide. We're going to talk about a term called haram. Now, I'm not Hebrew enough to really say that word with any respect. So you might just hear me say haram, because that's just good old Texan talk right there. And then we're going to close this out with
sorry about that.
With holiness, because this entire topic, when we talk about genocide, which is baked in the conquest text, is not about what did God kill, but what did God take? What did God take and make His and make pure? And that's really the key of it. For things, takeaways. You change slides on me too. I think you can control my slides. I like that. Key takeaways. I want you to see the conquest text within the first covenant context. So oftentimes we're guilty of reading some scripture and we see something like utterly destroyed, and then we go, well, we take our English with our modern day bias and we go, God's a killer. And that's how we get to the conclusion. But I want you to see what's really happening in the text, inside the first covenant context. When I say first covenant, that's the Old Testament. And then for those of you who are Christians, I want to say, look, I want you to be able to place pebbles in shoes. If you're not a Christian, I want to be able to put a pebble in your shoe. That's a phrase that comes from Greg Koukl, who wrote a book called Tactics. He really asked 2 questions. What do you mean by that, and how did you come to believe that? And I want you to be able to walk away to at least having some view or understanding of the real God in the Bible. It's not some make-believe violent character, that it's really a person who is at work, who is pursuing us with His presence. And that's what's going to take us into the holiness portion of our conversation. So this is talked about often in a lot of ways. And if you've been in church in any amount of time, you'll hear it in this way. People were bad, so God punished them. That's kind of the end, right? And we go, the Canaanites were wicked, and so God said He just let their sin just play out, and so then, wipe them off the face of the earth. There's a lot of truth baked behind all that. We can touch on some of that and talk about the Canaanites. I'm actually not going to cover the Canaanites themselves, because I think we can make this argument without having to talk directly about the sinful behavior. We're not going to eliminate it. We're not going to downplay it. But it gives us a partial view of God. It just says God is looking from up here and He's watching good and bad, and then bad gets death. And that's an incomplete view. So I don't want to talk with that talk track today. The other one is God is sovereign, and it's kind of like enough said. Well, yeah, I mean, God is sovereign, and we can talk about that, but that doesn't do the word sovereign any justice, and it kind of kills the conversation. So in other words, what does that mean? God is sovereign. God can do what He wants, when He wants, how He wants, because He simply willed it. So He wanted to have His people the Israelites move into the land, into the promised land, and so He just needed to move some people away. And because it's God's sovereign, He can do what He wants. Well, yes, like if we wanted to kind of get to some of the specifics of that, but that's not helpful when we try to answer the question, did God command genocide? The other typical approach within Christian circles is often to ignore or downplay because we feel guilty. It's like, oh gosh, man, that's in the Bible. It says utterly destroy men, women, and children. Like, that makes me uncomfortable. So I don't, what do I do with that? Oh, well, there wasn't that many people in Jericho, which we'll read about here in a second. So it's okay. Oh, okay. So as long as it was only like 100 deaths and not 100,000 deaths, then we're saying it's like degree of violence matters. That's how we answer the question. So we're not going to play that. But what we will play in and where we will spend most of our time is really the misapplied and misunderstood terms. We're misapplying even the term genocide, and we're misunderstanding the language, at least in the English translation, of utterly destroy or devoted to the Lord or placed under the ban. There's a number of translations for that. So we're gonna start there. That's where we're gonna be first, though. Since the accusation is coming out of the Bible, let's talk about the Bible. So the first question I like to ask people when they say, well, yeah, God killed everybody. I want to ask, how much about the Bible do you know first? Tell me what you know about the Bible. Because what I often find is if they know something about the Bible, then we can have a real biblical conversation. If not, if you looked on somewhere online and got an internet meme that simply said, see, genocide, biblical God, he killed all these people. Well, that's not helpful. You're believing into something that somebody just made. But the Bible itself is not a book. It's actually a library. 66 books, many writers, different styles, one author. We call the author the Holy Spirit, God's Spirit. The entire book is written over about a 1,500 time period, and it's written in 30 languages, and one of those 3 languages is not English. And so that's important to us because when we start looking at the text with our cognitive environment, how we live today, we really have to transport ourselves back to a different cognitive environment. It's ancient text. This is ancient Near Eastern text. This is not a Western American text, so we can't just take our version and go, oh yeah, that's genocide. Part of the Bible is, and I like this, relevant and significant for us, but it's not written to us. It's written in a language we don't understand to a culture that's not ours. Culture of Hebrew and ancient Hebrew is much different than what we live today. And they think differently. I'll read this quote. I like this from Dr. John Walton. He says, the Bible exists to tell us what God is doing. It describes what God is doing in terms of the language, logic, and values of the culture to which it was originally written. So that's where I'm coming from in the Bible, and I think it's key that we have sort of at least a level understanding about what is the Bible. And so with that, what we want to do today is really the first of the conquest text is the fall of Jericho. And so if you have a Bible, flip there, tap there, whatever you do. I'm going to read some text to you guys. I'm going to bounce around. But I want you to hear the text first, and then we'll talk about the text and apply some terms and terminology to it. I'm actually going to be in Joshua chapter 5, we'll start in verse 13. And I'm going to bounce around. I'll let you know where I bounce around to. And it says, now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, are you for us or against us? Neither, he replied, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I now come. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, what's the message? What messages my Lord have for his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army replied, take off your sandals, for this place where you are standing is holy. So part of this begins to build the argument around why this is not genocide is because, one, there's not an us versus them. And that's what Joshua was asking the first question. Now, what this also helps us understand is there a command at play? Absolutely. In fact, God sent the commander of his army down. So something is about to take place. And we already know that there's an amount of holiness that's at play. Now, I'm parachuting us literally into a moment in time. What's taken place before all this has been hundreds of years of Old Testament history with the Israelites, all the way from Adam and Eve to Abraham to Noah, Abraham, Moses, and now here we are at Joshua. And what's significant about all of this is that Moses and the Israelites have been wandering around in the desert. We call that the wandering around. They are homeless, essentially. And so they are crossing, they have come out of Egypt. They are spending time with God. They are doing what God has asked them to do. They're being obedient. God is making them a holy people through a whole lot of different actions and activities. Moses dies, Joshua takes over, and now they're crossing the Jordan River. And so we see a series of large miracles take place up until this point. And now we have this angel, this army of commanders. So here they are. We'll talk about Jericho. It says, now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. So it's a bit of a fortress. Then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. So we know what kind of people are there, at least a king and some of its fighting men. Now he gives us some instructions. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets and ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them, sound a long blast in trumpets. Have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall and the city will collapse, and the army will go up, everyone straight in. So what we don't have is a typical what's not being painted, which is what often is painted by skeptics or unbelievers or just internet memists, is Israel didn't walk into a neighborhood and just start slaughtering men, women, and children. So that's not happening here at all. So instead, what we're doing now, they're given some really strange commands to do some walking around. And so we're gonna jump over to 16. Then the 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are devoted to the Lord. So that's an interesting statement. Parking lot, that one. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared. So, okay, there's somebody else that we know is there, right? So Rahab, who is a scandalous woman of types, is there. And she's got a mother and brother and a mom. Later on, it's listed who's there with her. So she's got her family with her. And it says, only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her shall be spared, because she hid the spies when that we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All silver, gold, and articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into the treasury. So there's no sides here, right? This is showing us that it's not about capturing and completely destroying and slaughtering, because the same rules apply to Israel that are being applied to the Canaanites right now. Which is a funny statement, because in chapter 7 here, one of them breaks the rule. So I think there's a little bit of foreshadowing on God's part. A couple more verses. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and the sound of the trumpet. At the sound of the trumpet, when men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. I'm going to jump down to 24. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze into the treasury of the Lord's house. So, did we just read a historical account of genocide? Well, let's talk about genocide. What do you mean by genocide? When World War II, when the concentration camps and the tortures and all the horrors really started to become public, Winston Churchill said, it's a crime that has no name. But it was named in 1944 by a guy named Raphael Lemkin. He wrote a book talking about the axis of evil rule in Europe. He was a Polish Jewish lawyer, and his life's work went into helping form what is now part of the UN and what we call Article 2 inside their human rights group. And so let me read our own definition. This is our modern day definition. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethical, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, or forcibly transferring children to the group, from the group to another group. So you could say, well, yeah, I mean, we killed in whole some Canaanites, but the part isn't about the volume of people who got killed. What we have to understand is, are we attacking a national, ethical, racial, or religious group? And we're going to demonstrate that's not true, but that's not the case. With the Rwandan, PBS Frontline did some really great work documenting the Rwandan genocide, and took a couple pieces from this that are just worth reading. Genocide is a crime on a different scale to all other crimes against humanity and implies an intention to completely exterminate the chosen group. Genocide is therefore both the gravest and greatest of the crimes against humanity. So we throw around the term genocide because somebody died. And it doesn't do the term genocide justice. In fact, it waters down the actual term genocide. So we got to be real careful that we're calling some event in the Old Testament genocide because, well, there's death and mass casualties. That same article goes on to say a genocide is a conspiracy aimed at total destruction of a group and thus requires a concerted plan of action. The instigators and initiators of genocide are cool-minded theorists first and barbarians only second. The specificity of genocide does not arise from the extent of the killings, nor the savagery or resulting infamy, but solely from the intention, the destruction of a group. So our own term genocide is not beginning to hold any water towards the Canaanite conquest events, because what we do know is that the plan wasn't a secret. There was no conspiracy to do this, and that goes all the way back to really Deuteronomy 7. Should I find Deuteronomy 7? Let me just read you guys a couple, what is stated in there. He says, I'll read a couple verses. So when the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drive out before you many nations, Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God has delivered them to you and you have defeated them, you must destroy them totally. We'll get into that. Make no treaty with them. Show them no mercy. That's the other word that people get hung up on. But here's kind of where it goes. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give them to your daughters. Give their daughters to your sons, or take their daughters for your sons. For they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. Okay. Here's the other thing. It's not a secret. This is actually what I want to read to you. It's not a secret. So in Joshua 2, it says, I know, this is Rahab. So Rahab, spies go into Jericho. They're checking out stuff. Rahab takes the spies. She's hiding the spies. This is a conversation between those Israelite spies and Rahab. And it says, I know that the Lord has given you this land and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting away in fear because of you. So they knew the plan. So there's an understanding, there's no conspiracy here to act. It says, we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea coming out of Egypt. For when you came out of Egypt and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard it, and our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is the God in heaven, above and on the earth. So they're not saying, we know you're coming to kill us because of who we are. We know that your God is at work and is doing something, and we're fearful of what your God is doing. So genocide, back to genocide. Genocide is a modern concept, not an ancient Near Eastern understanding. That text just kind of proves that. They're not talking about the complete and utter destruction of a people group. They're not saying, hey, because we're Canaanites, because of who we are, because of the color of our skin, because of our belief system, you're coming to hunt us down. And in fact, nowhere in Scripture is there a systematic killing or tracking down of Canaanites. And in fact, not all Canaanite cities were actually destroyed. 3 were only burned down out of the 20-ish that were taken. So my argument here is that the term is overused and is progressively losing its real meaning. We're throwing around genocide like it means nothing, and it's really a disservice to human rights. Yes, ma'am, go.
So I see you're talking a lot about the Canaanites, but you did say that there were only. Well, my question is what about the Hebrews and when that one king who went to go kill all the firstborn so that way Jesus couldn't be a thing? Are we only focusing on the Canaanites, or are we?
Yeah, I am.
The others?
No, that's good. So I'm not covering all of what might be considered violent texts. So if you're talking about King Herod and his orders to kill babies, not talking about Pharaoh, and I'm staying out of Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Chronicles right now. And the reason for that is 1, because that's a lot of ground to cover in this short time. And 2 is, if you can understand the same framework here, you can apply that same stuff to those. Now, the King Herod situation is a little bit different.
Well, yeah, but with the Hebrews, it was definitely based on race and ethnic background.
Absolutely. But King Herod was not a man of God. King Herod made his own order to kill others. So that's a much different topic, right? Because God didn't command the killing of children in that case. But yeah, we do see in our text here.
Well, that was just because if it, like the modern concept of genocide, and then you kind of skip over like the pharaohs and the Hebrew genocide, which is kind of the whole basis of Christian God.
What do you mean by basis of Christian God?
You know, Moses in the river, leading his people, let the people go.
Yeah.
Well, if there wasn't the idea of the whole modern concept of genocide, then we wouldn't have the 10 Commandments and what led on to be the Old and New Testament.
Yeah, so let me parse that out a little bit. I think I know where you're going. Like, where did we get our moral code from? If you're trying to say, hey, the 10 Commandments helped formulate our moral code, thou shalt not kill, right? And then in 1944, the actual term was created as genocide. And then it created a framework for how does the UN and the world going forward determine a genocidal act? What's that criteria and stuff? But yes, I mean, if you're trying to say, hey, look, the basis of killing and death and evil and all those things over time kind of built up to a modern day understanding of genocide, I mean, we could certainly make a case for that. I mean, I'm not arguing against that.
Right. I just wanted to understand.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you raised your hand. Yeah, because again, so I'm honing in very much so on the conquest text, right? And the conquest is Joshua, after Moses died, they cross over the Jordan River and they begin to take the promised land, right? Which is a set of boundaries, and that is a limited specific point in time and a geography that ultimately becomes where, that's the land becomes the key to this ultimate salvation to when Jesus comes, right? So this is a pivotal point. So I'm only talking about those, but the same concept, this notion of when anytime in the Bible, whether it's Judges, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, or Samuel, where we see utterly destroy, totally destroy, what are we really talking about there? Are we really talking about genocide, even in the way we would define genocide? And my answer to that is no. A few other proof points against why the Canaanite conquest really isn't genocide. It's not about ethnic cleansing, it was about holy purification. It started off about being holy. So you're standing on holy ground. God was already at work doing a holy thing through a people he was making holy. It's also, if we look at Rahab and we say, well, if it was genocide, then why is Rahab alive? Right? So in World War II, did Nazis simply just let Jews go? They were hunting them down in houses. But yet we see an example of one where God saves. So if we really needed to eliminate all ethnicity, why would we do that? And why would she be part of Jesus's lineage if it had anything to do with ethnicity? If we look at Achan, Achan is one chapter over. So quick story on Achan. When I told you, hey, don't touch the things devoted to the Lord, right? Gold and silver. Well, Achan couldn't keep his hands off of it. So Achan takes some of the goods back to his camp. Joshua finds out, guess what? The same punishment that was applied to the Canaanites in that moment was also applied to Achan later. He was stoned to death and killed. His whole family was. So what are we really talking about then? If we're willing to kill one of our own for the actions, are we really talking about genocide? Are we talking about God grabbing a hold of something and trying to purify something? And I'll talk about that in a second. Death in the Bible doesn't mean God or the Israelites were genocidal. Just because they're death doesn't mean we can simply throw around and loosey-goosey the term genocide. There was no conspiracy. I read that a minute ago. And then nowhere in the text is there a systematic hunting down of people. And in fact, later on, at the end of Joshua 23, verse 12, it says, but if you turn away and ally yourselves with the survivors of these nations. Well, if we're hunting people down and destroying them, who are these survivors of these nations? Because in a real genocide, like in Rwanda, 800,000 people died in like 5 days. It was brutal terror, brutal killing. So if the Israelites had that same mindset, that same barbaric mindset, who are these survivors? So if God didn't command genocide, then what did he command? What is going on? We know there's a command. We've already established that. We know there's an activity taking place. So what did he command? There's a term called harem. And in most of our translations in NIV, CEV, ESV, it's terms like utterly destroyed, completely destroyed, totally destroyed. I like the CEV is I think the closest. It is placed under a ban. Well, what are we banning? Why does something need to be under a ban? And so when we start to unpack, get out of our literal English language translation when we read these things and then apply our modern day view, and we look back at the Hebrew text and do the work of translation there, we can see that really what we're saying is it's seclude by ban, devote something, give something to somebody else to do something with, make away from, so get away from it or forfeit it. Really the idea of haram is removal of something from human use. No one shall make use of this. So it becomes about the object that humans shouldn't use. Destruction is not the essential meaning. It's not about the destruction in itself. It's not about the killing. Now, it's part of it, because how do you prevent human use of something? You destroy it. But it's a process of devoting things to the Lord for the Lord's purpose. God was taking the promised land so that he could use that land for what he wanted to accomplish. There's really 4 types of haram that we see. Inanimate objects, that's the gold, silver. The rarest one actually is living individuals. And then abstract identity of community. So today we would call those things like your culture, those ideas that we live in. And then cities, and we see tons of examples in this. Cities are emptied and vacated. They become devoted to God for God's purpose. So, the idea here is that the purpose of haram in the conquest is not ethnic cleansing. It is not to purge Canaanite genetics. In fact, in Matthew 15, Jesus has an encounter with a Canaanite woman. So if we're destroying Canaanites, why are there even Canaanites later on in scriptures? The scriptures are clear. The purpose of the conquest was to remove the religious and moral identity of the Canaanite community so that Israel would not use it. We over-index on the death and destruction, and we under-index on the fact of what God was doing, which was to make a people holy. And that's also why I don't start this conversation with, well, the Canaanites were wicked and bad. Because we over-index on the sin. Don't hear me say downplay sin and be soft on sin. But we simply hone in on that, and we don't realize that it's not just don't sin, or that if you are a grave sinner, you're just equals God's punishment. And that's the end of the conversation. It's over-index or equally index on righteousness and holiness. He's trying to make something new. And that's the purpose of haram. He's taking it for ownership to make something new. And we see this play out in the New Testament, right? When Jesus comes on the scene and we talk about being born again, it's talking about being made new. So it's a same concept of haram, and we see this even in the New Testament. Shed your old self, get rid of your old self, die to self. It's the same concept. That doesn't mean go kill yourself, right? That's not what we're talking about here. So if we're not taking it literal in the New Testament, then why do we take it so literal in the Old Testament? Just wrapping up here for you guys, and we'll jump into some Q&A. Again, holiness is at the heart of the conquest. God cares about our identity and our purity. That's where Leviticus, the book of Leviticus, is very much that. The book of Leviticus is not a bunch of clobber texts and rules for today. Don't get tattoos, don't cut your hair. It was about making Israel holy so that God's presence could dwell with them. What's great about the conquest too is, and at the beginning of that and the purpose of that is, it's about making old things new. Or just making things new, it doesn't have to be old. Making bad things new, just renewing, purifying. When God takes ownership of something, it is always good. Even if maybe the path to get there from our human understanding, like totally destroying men, women, and children, cattle, sheep, donkeys, feels bad, seems bad. There's something new at play here that we have to respect. In that same template, when we look at the New Testament, there's a final new coming as well. If you're a Christian and you know what that means, we call that the hope. It's the renewing of all things. And again, we over-index on Jesus is coming back to judge all the sinners, and he's going to bring a sword, and we love that part of the story because that excludes us, right? If you're a follower of Christ, they're going to get what's coming to them. I don't think that's the right way to approach that fully. Is that going to happen? Yes. So I guess that's kind of part of my closing point here under how we talk about holiness and identity. What comes out of the conquest events really this. Hey, if the conquest activities and the violence of that troubles you, well, there's a final conquest coming on earth. So we where does that lead? Look, just to close it down, we'll jump into some questions. Not genocide. It's just not genocide. Haram was not about destruction, it's about preventing something from human use. What are those things that we wanted to prevent from human use? Identity. We can talk about the Canaanites and their wickedness. But God is working to make all things new, and the conquest event repeats itself in the New Testament, as I already mentioned a minute ago. All right, so I sped through that. I talked a ton, jumped around some scriptures. I'll take whatever questions you got. I may or may not answer them. And I may or may not answer them very well. Go.
So during this, we focused on the Canaanites. Why did we specifically focus on the Canaanites and not on the other instances of Haram?
Well, within the conquest event, that's really where you see Haram, the notion of utterly destroy, totally destroy, placed under a ban. That's where you see that most heavily. I just drilled in on the Canaanites.
And let me also respond to that, Jason, that most of the times when we hear famous people like Bill Maher or the late Christopher Hitchens or Dawkins, they specifically refer to the Canaanites. I don't know if you've read the book, The God Delusion, specifically talking about the Canaanites, because that's the most visible and publicized area where the Israelites went in, and these verses say they killed everything in sight. So that's really, I think, why Jason centered on them. But I like your point, if I can expand on a little bit, your first question, that the Egyptians were practicing genocide when they said, throw every Israelite baby boy in the river, right? And so there's many examples of genocide, and that genocide actually worked to the good of God's people because Moses was spared, taken into Pharaoh's family. So there's lots of examples of genocide, including Jesus almost got caught up in that, right? When Herod. So does that answer your question though about why Canaanites? There could be other discussions that we could go on and talk about others as well.
And the thing with the idea that it's a genocide is a modern day concept, but we can all agree that there was definite genocides in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I would say attempt, right? Like the Egyptians did not wipe out the Hebrews.
Right.
There was a command to go kill babies. There was a violent act to destroy a generation of children. But a genocide was not completed. And that's part of like spinning this to the UN, and why I keep saying modern day concept is even in the framework, some people argue today in our world, we argue that maybe the UN is even too strict on their own framework for calling something genocide. So like, for example, we have the Muslim Uyghurs in China right now, forced abortions, tons of atrocities, but yet we don't call that genocide. And so I guess that's kind of when I think about the term and I go, well, we always want to accuse God of massive atrocities and we just say he's evil and he's bad. But yet when we look over here in our own backyard, our own globe, we're not even willing to call it that with what's happening in China. I'm not going to defend that it is or isn't genocide over there. I'm simply saying we make all these arrogant accusations at God and we fling around definitions that we're not even fully applying to really atrocious situations in our modern era.
And so,
I agree with that. Yeah.
so Jason, the point you're defending is, did God command genocide? And I think Jason would be saying, and I'd agree, in the Bible, God does not command genocide. Now, certainly we see stories of genocide, Herod, Pharaoh, etc.
Did he command killing and death? Well, sure. I mean, we just read it. But that's not anything we have to back away from. It's not commanding murder. He was commanding the removal of certain things from human use. I mean, the Canaanites were wicked. I mean, just a quick slide here. I mean, if you just look at Leviticus 18, I mean, here's some of the practices that the Canaanites were in. And you know, it's really interesting. So child sacrifice, incest, idolatry, adultery, homosexuality, abuse. Like we would leave that list kind of like, we're kind of soft on that. Like, okay, we get kind of hung up on child sacrifice and incest. All the rest of that's kind of like, well, I mean, you know, to each his own. That's why I don't ever start with the sin of the Canaanites. But the reality of it is their culture was extremely wicked, even for our day and age. Child sacrifice, what are they doing? So they had a god Molech. It's a metal cow bull man thing. And they would heat it up and they would put their babies and their children onto the hands alive of this hot, glowing red hot metal, and let their children burn and melt there. And they would bang on drums louder and louder so they didn't have to hear the children screaming. These things were wicked, absolutely wicked. We can't downplay their actions. So why do I start with the Canaanites? Yeah, because part of what God was removing from humans' use was that ability to have that grave of evil. And I find it interesting that a lot of folks want to say, you know, they want to knock God, accuse God, and say, oh, we committed genocide, oh, he's a killer. But yet then when he comes in and rescues and stops an evil, where's the credit God gets for that? So if we're going to hold God accountable to what we view as atrocities, then we need to hold God accountable and thank God for the same freeing that he did.
Jason, I just want to expand on that. That's a really good point. A lot of times, so thinking about our apologetics conversations or responses, a lot of times the people that make this point, it's a very ironic point for them to make, because what they're really saying is God is evil in that he caused this bad thing to happen. And even in our current world, he doesn't stop evil from happening. If he's so sovereign and all powerful, he could just stop. I don't know if you know what's going on with the Uyghurs in China. He could stop that from happening. He could have stopped the Rwandan, right? But the irony is, as Jason just said, here's a real clear instance of where God said, I'm going to stop this evil. A little bit like Sodom and Gomorrah, boom, right? He used the Israelites to stop the evil, and he doesn't get any credit for it. So it's an ironic sort of claim against God. When God stops evil, he's considered to be evil himself, right? The other apologetic response that I think is useful here, this claim against God and Christianity is usually just plain old rhetoric. It's somebody who wants to use a rhetorical argument to score some points. It doesn't hold up when it's really examined. And so if you're ever given this in a meme or even in person to person, you can really just say, that's just rhetoric. Prove that point. I'd like to hear your evidence for that point. It's just rhetoric. And if you get somebody in an intelligent argument or intelligent discussion, then you can go through some of the things that Jason talked about as well. But it's easy to say, oh, that sounds good, but it's rhetoric, it really is. Yeah.
What else?
Can we expect another haram righteousness in the modern day?
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, the only way I'll speak to that is when if you read through the New Testament and you read through even like 1 Peter and 2 Peter through Ephesians, right? It talks about a renewing of all things, a coming of Christ, a coming back of Christ, right? So that's the only thing Scripture talks about, is there's a final judgment and a final renewing of all things. I mean, that's the only. I mean, I wouldn't get into the debate of, is there going to be another total utter destruction? I don't know if God's at work. If you believe God is alive and at work, God's at work. And if you believe that our actions today matter, and that if even if it was a 1-to-1 ratio, that because the Canaanites sinned and had the wickedness, and so therefore they were judged, if that's just the one line of, 1-to-1 that we want to make, that, well, then we should look at our actions and be afraid and be troubled that there could be another type of event. But that's not where Christians put their hope, right? We don't put our hope in this final killing, this final judgment, right? That's not hope. We put our hope in the renewing of all things, that one day there is no sin. These kinds of atrocities don't even exist. It's not even in the human heart. And that's a better place to be. That's an eternal view to have. It's a good question.
It's also biblical to you look at God's nature and character through the Bible. And for example, remember Jonah, right? Jonah was sent to Nineveh. Why was he sent to Nineveh? Because the Ninevites were like the Canaanites. They were practicing evil ways. God was not happy with them. And Jonah said, I don't really want to go there because I'd prefer that you just destroy them. He went, and the Ninevites repented. And God said, I'm not going to destroy you now. I'm not going to punish you. So there's that example, the example of Sodom and Gomorrah, the example of the Israelites themselves. They continued to not follow God, and God let them be conquered, and they were taken away by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians, by the Egyptians, by the Romans in Jesus' time. So certainly we know the character of God is one where his patience does run out at times. And there are some that would even say, the USA has been in a better place before in terms of God's favor. And yesterday, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, God was probably looking upon us more favorably. But do we know that the mind of God is in a place where he's ready to punish us or strike us down? No, we don't. Do we know that 9/11 was a result of God's punishment? We don't know. Do we, some people claim that the AIDS virus was sent by God toward wicked people? No, we don't know that. And it's, I think to Jason's point, it can be harmful or destructive for us to kind of predict those things just because we don't know. We do know the end of the world, and that Jesus will come and separate the sheep from the goats. But when that day, no man knows, right? Yeah. Good question. Are you sure, Jeffrey? All right, buddy. Okay.
Cool. Well, if nothing else.
Anything else for Jason? Okay. Thank you, Jason. Let's give a round of applause. So couple announcements, and I want to start with to your right over here, ladies, is Dr. George Damoff. And he's gracious to join us because he cares about UNT, he cares about apologetics and spreading the Christian faith and teaching UNT students. So you'll see him often. He's teaching next week. And last year, he taught on earthworms as an element of God's design, showing God's unique design for creatures, including earthworms. He's an earthworm expert. Now, next week, he's teaching on a topic around biblical Christian environmental stewardship. The title is, What is it to be human on a warming planet? And Dr. Damoff, would you just give us a quick little intro to that so we can understand what we're going to hear and what we'll learn next week?
Yeah, it's my background is ecology, forestry, done research. I've taught at universities, Christian and state schools like UNT. And I have taught environmental science classes at the college level, and have read environmental science textbooks written from a secular perspective. And then I've also read a lot of writings from PhDs who are in the environmental arena, who are also Christians. And so I'm drawing on all that experience and giving this presentation. And it's more of a theological and philosophical presentation on how to approach hot button issues on the environment. I'm going to use climate change, global warming, which is, front burner right now. I don't know how much time you have to look at the news, but a big part of the $3.5 trillion money that Congress is talking about is tied to what has been out in the popular media called the Green New Deal. And the international panel, what's it, the ICC, what's the name of it now? International Governmental Panel, they have said a few months ago, they said that climate change, global warming we are on red alert. We have passed the point of no return, and so what do? So it's very much out there. So I'm gonna not so much tell you what to think as far as how to think, how to interpret that, but what are some of the tools from a biblical worldview or perspective on how to